Good morning, Richard. How are you?
Hello, good morning, Stephen. How are you?
Doing well. So today's topic, we're going to talk about the art of storytelling, why it's important in branding, why it's important in a lot of, entertainment pieces that we see, why it's important for culture in general, and why it's important for Prefecture Go. So, Richard, you just shared an awesome document with me last night. So I wanted to kind of talk a little bit about that first, because I think that really sets up, our conversation nicely.
Mm-hmm. It fits into the last conversation about AI and the destruction narrative of AI when we write it in stories for entertainment. How do we balance that with actual telling a story without destruction? How do you balance that kind of thing? So.
Right. And our last topic we talked about in our last podcast, and please check that out, was about AI. So, I mean, this ties right into it. And the document you sent me was Utopia versus Dystopia. And it spoke a lot about how, correct me if I'm wrong, how people place technology in this dystopian kind of mindset, and how that puts a negative into the storyline. And Prefecture Go and the storyline we're creating is a little more of a utopia, right? So,
or striving towards a utopia. And I think, well, the examples we used talking about AI, every movie we use examples of AI are extreme AI. When we talk about, what was it, iRobot?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And HAL in Odyssey 2001. And what was it? There's another movie. It was kind of rare, but I liked it. It's Eagle Eye.
Mm-hmm.
All those movies, the highlight of the movie is the AI. That's why it's so highlighted. But if you think about movies like, or TV shows like Star Trek, or my favorite is Demolition Man. Mm-hmm. There is AI in Demolition Man, but it's the characters that are more highlighted than the AI. The AI happens to just be the background. And if we can balance those two things where AI does enough for us for the city, that would be, but actually the importance of the story is the characters.
Right.
They're highlighted. They're the ones that control what goes into the, to the AI. So I thought that was important. Yeah. And
so, for all the viewers who are watching, the Prefecture Go platform is based upon a story, which we're not going to reveal the story in this conversation. We're going to maybe touch upon some points, and tie in from last week a little bit. We introduced Kaylee as one of our characters, and Kaylee is our artificial intelligence, generator, in governess, as we call her, over the educational piece and giving guidance and things like that. So it's a very positive type of mentorship, if you will, in an artificial intelligence kind of paradigm. But with our topic today, we're looking at how a story creates, a culture. It creates an entire brand for, in our case, we're filling in sort of that cosplay, gaming, fantasy, if you will, kind of mindset for the storytelling. And Richard's, written a fantastic story, that has spaces to, prove and fill in and add on from the front end or the back end of the story. And it'll constantly evolving as we, move forward with, our graphic novels and with the games and all those things. But digging really deep into different stories, I know you mentioned a few in a minute ago. One of my favorites, of course, that we talk about a lot when we're looking at the storyline for Prefecture is Star Wars, or we could even go with Lord of the Rings as one of those types of stories that builds an entire culture around that story. And Star Wars is a great example because of it being set in the future. It's set in maybe a little bit of a dystopia kind of mindset, because that's the whole piece is, about revolution and trying to, come to a level of peace, and it just layers over and over and over again, and in that type of process. But for a brand, what George Lucas has created was something he didn't intend to create. He just wrote a story. He didn't intend to create this machine, if you will, from that storyline. Where in our aspects, I think we are trying to create a machine from the story. We're using the story for leverage for the game. We're using the story as leverage for talking about, getting people interested in other things besides just the educational piece, but also in the characters that are part of that educational piece, about what those characters' lives were like. And, uh, you know, we can touch upon it a little bit without revealing the entire kit and caboodle, but the current graphic novel we're working on, which is on our website, as a preview cover right now, is about Bibi Akamoto and her backstory. Richard, do you want to give a little piece of what that story is about, without digging in too deep?
Um, we Bibi Akamoto is part of the original Prefecture Go Academy uh, during the story, and she's the and you can, like I said, you can look on our website and see her bio. But she was raised by two parents. Well, I should first say that there's a decision that needs to be made during the story, and there's two sides. There's the prefecture side and there's the parish side, and she has to make a decision of what city, and and one could say that one's dystopia, and one could say one is a utopia. But that's a decision that she has to make in the story, and she has to decide what she wants. And her parents had raised her to be well-rounded, and she has to make a decision, based on whether she wants to do it for herself or do it for the community, for her people. Basically, it's a story, and we'll have more on that. But one is to help. The prefecture is the the circular city with the school, and the parish is some other alternative of that. And she has to make her decision on which one she wants to do, kind of thing. And that tells that part of the story. Yeah. Yeah.
And I think that's a really interesting part with this piece, because every character that we have in our story, like any character in any story, have to make a decision. In her case, she has to make a choice between, a utopia and a dystopia. The parish is exactly the way it sounds. It's not a nice place, but it has some value. Where the utopian prefecture is this nice, protected, clean environment, damaged from, something that happens in our storyline, but still something that has a lot of positive meaning. And that's, where the basis of our story continues. But the backstory and the choices that have to be made are really important in any storyline. And I think that they help people um, lose themselves a little bit out of their own reality and help them find a way of making better choices for themselves. Um, I could list umpteen characters right off the top of my head in the same kind of, conundrum. Do I choose good or do I choose evil? Do I choose this path or that path? And it helps make a story dynamic, but it also helps bring life to that character, because the character becomes more real. And because that character becomes more real, people want to become that character to a certain degree. I could pick on, different cosplay characters that I'm, very sort of passionate about. One being Deadpool. I'm not saying that he's the most perfect, upstanding citizen in the world, but
Mhm.
for what it's worth, his heart's in the right place. He is trying to, do good in the world in his own backwards way. But I find that character interesting. Every person has a character they like. Most children want to be a character at Halloween, at some point. Sometimes I could pick up my own kids. One year they're a crayon, the next year they're Spider-Man, the next year they're a Lego block, then they might be Wolverine. There's, they ebb and flow between, something that's kind of like cutesy and then something that is like a character or cosplay type, person. And of course, when they are Wolverine or Spider-Man, you'll get the, you know, arm out and the web action and of course the sound effect that fits in with it, pew pew, and on goes life. But as they become older and we become more involved with our stories, right? That uh, the stories that we like to see and the stories that we're part of, um, we seem to gravitate things that either help us forget what's going on in our real world, in our real lives, and live in some other space. Now, that could be people that like fantasy type, fiction. It could be people that like, um, you know, factual things like biographies. I know my mother, she loves biographies, lots of biographies. It doesn't matter who's the biography about. If it's on some of an interest, she'll read it. And I think that she gets lost in that person's world, a little bit of what their historical fact is, but also starting to become part of it. And you lose yourself in that story. Um, Coming back to our platform, do you think, from what you've written so far, Richard, that people, as they start to go through the story and they start to explore it through graphic novels and through some other things, through our podcasts, our discussions, that that will be the case,
Um, what was the question again?
that they'll lose themselves, out of their own little, out of the reality and be part of the prefecture.
Yeah, I'm hoping so because we just put a foundation of the story, but um, as you progress through the comic, graphic novel, and through the game, once you start playing the game platform, we take information from you guys, and from then on, the story is written from the community of our students. So as you advance in the game and tell your part of the story, that's how the story gets advanced. And we have a unique thing that it's set in the present, 2031, but we will be telling backstories of each characters and the history of the city and more storytelling about prefecture, um, going back in the timeline, and we'll be telling many stories of that, and you guys can also enhance that. And one of the things, because we're talking about story writing, how do you solve technology and environmental issues without talking? We're talking about utopia versus dystopia. Is a what was it? Science and technology, but you have like religious beliefs, humanism, economy, and the ecology, without it being an argument or a debate. So we want to balance that out. So one of the things in our storyline is it's going to be called the hearth, and the hearth is um, I guess in mythological history, it's where everyone gathers to the flame or to the fire. And our hearth is going to be our blog, and it's going to be an open writing blog where you can tell your story about how to solve how it, you'd write your story, a mini blog on where do you want to see this prefecture city go? What is your experiences on technology, economy, and like I said, the environmental problems? And then we'll gather that and as a community, that's how the story will be extended of all of our students and developers. once they write their story, we take that in consideration for the curriculum and for how to go forward, kind of thing. We're setting the foundation of the story, but after that, once we get a following, you guys tell the story on how you want the city to go. So, and that's that student solution problem and individual to community, how to solve that. So
with you know, to unpack that just a little bit, you know, we just released this week the Digital Times on our website. Now, the Digital Times it shows about, you know, our podcast that we're having and our discussions, and it'll also talk about, you know, our graphic novel, you know, what the up and coming ones, and show the other ones, which will be a subscription based type of, you know, reading. But there's also a section there for you to see all the news that we write, all the discussions that we're going to have. And it enters into this blog piece that Richard is speaking of. And at some point in the near future, we will open up for you to have just sort of open forum to say, hey, you know, this is what I think about this story. You know, I think that we should be adding this, this, and this. I think that'd be really cool. And that's really important to us because we want to hear exactly what you'd like to create. Because as Richard said, you know, we're just laying a foundation, something that's a construct, if you will, for everyone to be engaged in and understand, you know, we have certain time marks for our storyline, but there's parts in the beginning, parts in the middle, parts at the end, parts in the future that are always there for people to give those suggestions and to write their own story in detail and provide that insight. And for those things to be considered in consideration for our graphic novels or for other parts of the, you know, the Prefecture Go world. Everything that we have, though, everything that we write, everything we put on our site, all of it will and allows you to go and log in and start to, you know, give comments. Please comment. You know, we can comment on our YouTube channel, comment about our blogs, those things. They all help grow the storyline. The other piece that I wanted to touch on, you know, as far as growing, you know, growing us the storyline itself, and I'm going to digress out of Prefecture just for a minute, is, you know, how stories help brands showcase, you know, their integrity. One of those stories that I follow on a regular basis, because I travel a tremendous amount, is Delta. I love Delta Airlines, how they present their story, and I love how they do that on the planes and how they reinforce things. And I love how they've applied a level of gamification to their app for people that travel. Most people don't realize that exists inside that app. That, you know, it becomes a little bit of a game. The more I fly, the more miles I get, the more status I have. I mean, that is a mild version of gamification. Along with how the app's designed, they've found a way to build a level of security through our pandemic we've had, not just because they've like every airlines have shuffled around things and tried to figure things out, but they did things that other airlines didn't do at first. And they created a space that people felt safe. And they did that through storytelling. You, as someone that doesn't travel a lot, or as someone that doesn't fly on that specific airlines, you may not realize it as much as someone that does fly on that airlines. So I want to kind of disclose that. You know, I've heard that US Air did the same thing. I heard some money out of the airlines started to do the same thing. But in that example, that's a way of using storytelling as a way to re-emphasize a brand, strengthen a brand, and get people to be more loyal towards that brand. So you have two different directions here. You have the storyline that builds a culture like Star Wars or Harry Potter or Lord of the Rings or, you know, Fast and the Furious. There's hundreds and hundreds of stories out there that have sequels and prequels that, you know, envelop that story. And then you have stories that are told by companies. You know, how do we do business? How is our ethics? How do we handle certain circumstances? And that story helps manage the perception of that brand outside of what other folks may or may not say. And so, I mean, I'd like to, have a little discussion about maybe that for a few minutes, if we could. And, what is your thoughts on, corporate brands that are we'll call them non-story based. They're not in the entertainment world.
Mm-hmm. That brings up, we talked about this, starting this is the balance between game-based, which is corporate type of gaming, and gamification, which is more of the entertainment side. Mm-hmm. So trying to find that balance between those two, the old school corporate learning videos that try to be a game but isn't successful, but also the AAA games where that's really entertaining, but is it educational? Am I learning anything? So we have to find, we're trying to find that balance, and it kind of actually blends into what we'll be talking about in 2 weeks. VARC. It's a teaser. It's a learning style, and it involves visual, audio, reading and writing, and kinesthetic, which is actual hands-on kind of like simulator games, but actually hands-on building. So I think if we find that middle ground between gamification and game-based storytelling, along with the input from the hearth and what we've already written and the visuals that you're going to be creating, and our team's going to be creating, I think we're doing something different. I think we're onto something. So,
do you think? And this is aside something just for a minute, because part of the Prefecture Go model is to get corporate companies to say, hey, we have people that we need that need to be employed in this specific space, and they need these types of skill sets. And through the education that we provide, through the gaming platform, is to design and put a person into that position, trained and ready to go, but out of the traditional classroom, right? That's sort of the preference for the viewer here. And do you think that storytelling and corporate, and I'll say it, video games or gaming, go hand in hand? Can we have a video game without a story?
No, because I guess the example, there's an actual gamification YouTube video out there, and the basis of the story was, I don't remember if it was a hotel or a bank. I'm like paraphrasing the story, but he was trying to teach gamification. It's a TED Talk, and he was trying to teach gamification, and it was about a father and a 13-year-old daughter trying to apply for something. I don't know if it was a loan or a grant or something, and the new worker who went through their corporate training program wasn't, even though she went through the program and passed and stuff like that, she was a new employee, and she didn't know how to recognize a Canadian ID card, and eventually the cops were called, and the father and the 13-year-old were in handcuffs because the employee thought they were trying to do a scam or they were criminals, but they weren't. They just had a Canadian ID card that she didn't recognize, because during her corporate teaching, they went through that whole old school teaching that she didn't comprehend that this is a Canadian ID card. But if the story that he told, like I said, I'm not telling it well, but if you would have just had that video of the father and the daughter in handcuffs because of a misunderstanding, and put it in cinematic form, most of the employees would know what a Canadian ID card looks like. And it's that kind of storytelling where it's more creative and more visual than just telling you A and B and multiple choice questions, and combining combining the story with actual learning, I think that's what we're trying to figure out. We're trying to tell. So that was one of the stories, but
Yeah, I remember you telling me that story a few weeks
yeah.
back, and what I found interesting, because of looking at how you would build out a curriculum or an interface, there's two ways of handling that. Here's a picture of Canadian ID card as an example. People sitting in a classroom just saw that, they might glaze over and not even notice it. They might not notice why what's the difference. We deal with I deal with this all the time traveling around. You probably do too. A New York State license, a Pennsylvania license, and a Florida license look a little different. And where your age, your birth date is when you go into the liquor store or anything else that requires that type of identification. Sometimes people take a minute to figure out where it is, versus knowing where it is. So people in Florida see a Florida license and they're like, oh yeah, that's where it is, because they see it all the time. But as soon as you throw a different, license in there, they're like, okay, I don't know quite where that spot is, because they aren't similar. Even though that's changing, they're not similar. Now, in this example, people would glaze over on that. They just saw the ID card, but having a human experience that triggers an emotion, which is what storytelling does, psychologically, it gives an emotion like, oh, or, wow, I don't want that to happen to me. I don't want that to happen to other people, or, wow, that's an empowering story, or, whatever the emotion is. The emotion embeds the learning inside the person's process. I personally love using stories, love telling stories in my client meetings, because I find that people listen better during the stories. I mean, you've heard 100 stories from me,
Yes.
and but I find that they keep people engaged in a conversation, and they also help give example. So I think that, and when I asked my question, I was more thinking towards having a game as a storyline, sort of, with like a lot of video games. There's a backstory, there's a front story, and then you're in the story playing it, which is sort of where we're going with ours in one way. But, what happens if you didn't have a story? What happens when you don't have a story around that part? And because it's education, I think you're absolutely right. You need to have those stories to really solidify the person's thought process and really help them start asking questions about what they know and they don't know. So in your example, I don't know. I personally don't know what a Canadian ID card looks like at all. I would be curious to look it up after this and see what it looks like. So I wouldn't, be as ignorant to that fact. But someone that's supposed to be in charge of that, that's really important.
Yeah, it's because she went through that process of her corporate training was just probably a multiple choice question. She saw a couple of pictures, but she had hundreds of videos, and she just went through it, touch screen or whatever. But if you would have just told it in a story, like like the gentleman on YouTube was telling, and actually just showed the video of the father and the daughter, it would have stuck more because it was just storytelling instead of just written multiple choice questions. And that's what we're trying to do with the current old school way of learning and more of a creative outlet kind of learning. And oh, and we were talking about the businesses and corporations on one side having curriculum and the student on one side, and the story in the middle. One of the things that we're trying to do too is the next generation X and generation Alpha is going to learn differently, and they're going to work differently. How they do things. And there's a study that said by 2025 or 2027, 65% of the jobs they're going to be jobs that don't exist today. And we want to find that. We want to find those jobs, and we want to help create the next. Elon Musk or the next Richard Branson innovators, the next, Thomas Edison kind of thing, where we don't know those new jobs. What are they going to be? And we talk to the corporations. Where do you think the trend is going? How do you see what your needs are, and tell a story in between in our fictitious story, but in our game platform, but actually use it for vocation, and then actually yeah,
I think that
implement it in real life.
I see that in learning. I hate to use the word traditional when I say this, but traditional learning now with my 3 kids. My oldest son, he learned closer to the way that we learned in school. Richard and we've learned, where now that I have helped the youngest one through homework, at night, there's a lot more problem solving type questions. Yes, there's still core skills, but the amount of problem solving questions has dramatically increased, and we all had to do those. If Jan had 5 apples and Jimmy had 5 apples, how many apples do they have together? One of those things. They do that now, but then they get more involved because they start leaving different blanks out because they're training someone to use critical thinking skills. And in a previous conversation with someone else, that is the number one attribute to people going into corporations and becoming leaders of departments, executive vice presidents, the top tier is they're creative. They have critical thinking skills. You don't get critical thinking skills by learning them. You get them by listening to stories. So the problem solving is a story. It's a mini story. It might be 4 sentences, but that's what it is. If Jane has 5 apples, and Jim has 5 apples, and then Tom comes and eats 2 apples, how many apples total are left? You now told a story between 3 people and their relationship of apples, to come up with a number. As you get down the road, I notice, those problem solving type homework activities become more challenging and more complicated, where you have to really think about every word that's there and to problem solve out the issue with the multiple blanks. And it's a really important piece in even what we're trying to do. I've also seen one of the things that I get challenged with, which is fundamental now in elementary school, is number blocks. And I'm probably not speaking about it correctly. Someone can always correct me, but instead of doing your traditional math where you have, your, numbers stacked with the plus and minus symbols or division or multiplication, and we follow in that traditional way, they're using other means to visualize math versus memorize math. And I think that that's, a unique change that I see. But again, it also allows you to visualize that problem when you're being told a story, because it is not a problem in corporate life, a challenge, a story. I tell my staff a story about that client before we go and talk about the challenge, because the story is just as important to solving that client's problem, because it's a unique problem to be solved, versus saying, we've done this in the past, this is what you do, go and have at it. That might not be the right solution for that client because of the story, because of their expectation. So I think that, come full circle, how do you vision, when we're looking at our platform and using gamification to help with some storytelling, do you see that being something, Richard, that will assist people to visualize better than traditional education?
Yeah, and like I said, the preview for the VARC way of learning, it also involves audio, reading and writing. That's why we want you to write on our blog, the Hearth, and kinesthetic. Eventually, we want to get to the point where you're actually doing it in either in a simulated AR or VR type situation, or actually, like I said, finally working for the company and actually, having a relationship with that company and actually doing it for them during that vocational training period. Yeah, but I do. But one of the things we're trying to do, that's why we're doing the podcasts. The podcasts are, we try to connect the podcasts to each other, and we're doing it every other Friday. And the digital times and the comic strip will come out the non-podcast week, so they're connected. So that we want to build the following to tell us where the rest of the story goes for our game platform. So that's the sequence we're trying to, and I see that, like I said, I see it develop through that. And then once we get a bigger following, then we can, we can take it in that direction. So.
Well, if you're watching this podcast now, we'll be working on getting that section where you can start telling your story off of our website. Take a look at the digital times. You'll see a section for you to send in something that's not a comment to something we've already posted. And we'll read everything. We look at everything. Please, please post appropriate content. That would be really appreciative of us, if you could do that. And don't try to sell us anything directly. I get 100 of those as well. But please tell us your story. We'd love to hear your story. We'd love to hear some ideas that you might have for what we've been talking about. And for those that are, watching this later down the line, it is there. Go ahead and let us know what you think. And next week in 2 weeks, our podcast is gonna be about VARC. And I think we have a guest speaker for that specific podcast. So that's exciting. I believe Donna's gonna be part of that, right?
Yes.
Excellent.
Donna will be there. And we'll try to invite more experts or more educators to help us out with that.
And if you ever think you might want to be a special guest on one of our podcasts, we're going to be starting to put the future casts on our digital times, so you kind of know what's coming up, and shoot us a note and say, I like to, maybe like to be on your podcast, and we'll get you connected and see if you the right fit to be part of our podcast. So
thanks, Stephen. And follow us on our YouTube channel, Prefecture Go Academy. So please.
Yeah, please subscribe to our YouTube channel so you can get the latest content when it comes out. It's posted the same day as we have the podcast. And of course, you can rewatch those on our podcast page on Prefecture's website.
Yeah, we'd love to hear from you. We definitely need your help. Thank you. Thanks, Stephen.
Thank you, Richard.
Thank you for watching our podcast. Subscribe to our channel. Let us know what you think and what you would like us to talk about next. Don't forget to check out our website at prefectureisp.com.